Welcome to episode 106 of the G2 on 5G. It's the latest inside scoop on everything 5G. We cover 6 topics in about 20 minutes, and it's brought to you by More Insights and Strategy. I'm Will Townsend, and joining me again this week is fellow analyst Anshel and Will. Let's get started with my first topic. And news broke this week that Cisco is partnering with General Dynamics to deliver private 5G services to U.S. federal governmental entities and agencies. And so my question is, what are the expected outcomes? So the details are no surprise. Cisco is leveraging its private 5G as a service, which is built on its own mobile core technology and pretty expansive IoT portfolio. I'm very familiar with Cisco's offer in that it's leveraging third parties for various radios. And it's no surprise that General Dynamics is a huge contractor to the federal government. So I believe this potentially puts Cisco in a very great light with respect to all the governmental agencies that are evaluating private 5G networks. You and I have spoken about different deployments within the federal government. I believe on one podcast we talked about a Marine Corps deployment, which involved sort of digitizing their logistical operations. And so from my perspective, I think it's a smart move. I mean, General Dynamics has the footprint. They're on GSA contracts. Certainly Cisco probably is as well, but I think it's sort of a marriage of 2 great companies, but would love to get your perspective.
Yeah, I mean, General Dynamics is probably one of the biggest defense contractors out there. So I think, they're just one of many that are trying to compete for these different contracts with the federal government. I don't know, was this explicitly stated for any specific departments? Or is this broadly like a GA thing?
It's very broad. So there weren't really any specific, points to, particular government agencies, but certainly in the military, I've talked about that on prior podcasts. The military sees obvious applications with 5G when you look at the latency for drone support and that sort of thing. But no, it appears to be a very sort of broad partnership at this point.
Okay. Interesting.
Yeah. Well, let's move to your first topic. And you want to talk about some delays with Apple's 5G modems.
Yeah. So there was a rumor that came out from one of the more famous, analysts out there that covers Apple supply chain. You might have heard of him. His name is Ming-Chi Kuo. And generally, his rumors tend to be accurate. Whether or not you agree with him or not. But what was interesting is this, tweet that, he said that Apple might be delaying its 5G modem was related to a design failure. But a couple of days later, other people pointed out that maybe it's not a design failure, but in fact, it could be a consequence of Apple losing its patent dispute with Qualcomm. Because they have been petitioning the Supreme Court to hear their case. They actually managed to appeal and lose enough times that they got all the way up to the Supreme Court. And they lost that as well. The Supreme Court would not hear their case. And within a day, Ming-Chi's, his article came out, or his tweet, I guess. And that to me indicates that maybe it was similar in the potential impact, but maybe, it sounded a little bit less drastic in the way that it was communicated. But either way, I would consider this a failure because if you lose a patent, if your design is based on a patent dispute or losing one or winning one, it's probably not a good design in my opinion. So I think that if you take that into account, it's pretty important to really think about that. And that's why I think that whatever's happening, Apple's probably going to be pushing their modem out another year or two. They do have an existing agreement with Qualcomm for patents. I believe it was a 5+2 year or a 4+2 year, somewhere between 6 or 7 year horizon. And they've already been at it for 3 years. So, they're going to have to probably sign another agreement with Qualcomm on the patent side, and I'm sure they're not going to be thrilled about it, which is honestly the purpose of their entire original legal spat with Qualcomm. They just don't like Qualcomm's terms even though everybody else was perfectly fine with them. And even Apple was up until a certain point. So
Yeah.
it's a very odd situation. Um, you know, a lot of people didn't even know that Apple was still fighting Qualcomm patents, even though they had already signed a a truce of sorts with their settlement. But this kind of puts a nail in the coffin in that at this point. And I think that Apple's probably going to have to go back to the drawing board in terms of their design or their agreements with Qualcomm, because I think long term Apple wants to put a 5G modem in everything,
Right.
and if Qualcomm gets to get a small royalty out of every single device Apple makes, that's not ideal for Apple's bottom line.
Right. Yeah, the bottom line is it affects the overall cost of producing an iPad that's enabled with cellular technology or an iPhone. So yeah,
Or a Mac, if that
yeah,
happens.
exactly.
Or even a watch.
Yeah, and it's interesting. So our chief principal analyst and CEO, Patrick Moorhead, he's written numerous articles on Forbes calling it the clown show. And I think I saw a tweet from Pat this week as well there. But yeah, this likely sets Apple back, considerably to your point, and it's just going to build more cost. But hey, Apple's a premium product. They can probably, buffet that, in the short term. But Apple's philosophy is they want to design everything, right? The silicon, everything. So
Yep.
this is probably pretty, pretty heartfelt on their part. But hey, Qualcomm, they've got great technology, and they continue to be a leader within the device space. So it'll be interesting to see. But yeah, it seems like finally that final nail was put in the coffin on this dispute, and yeah, we'll just have to see what happens with Apple long term. But let's go to my second topic this week, and my question is, what's the deal with Dish's 5G network performance and its inconsistencies? So it's been pretty widely publicized that Dave Mayo, who is the chief executive in charge of building Dish's 5G network, the chief network officer, acknowledges that Dish is well aware of the inconsistent performance that's been pointed out from recent reports from PC Magazine, as well as Signals Research Group. And what Mayo is pointing to is their implementation of voice over new radio. And we talked about this on our prior podcast with T-Mobile's implementation. I believe, Anshel, you spoke to that. So, basically they're admitting, Dish is admitting that, hey, voice over NR is not easy, nor was VoLTE, voice over LTE, when it was done, several years ago. And so that's sort of what they're pointing to. Really, but it was interesting in the articles that I've read, there's been sort of no, sort of resolution from Dish on when they're going to be able to resolve this. And, we've reported in the past, they were very behind on getting to their coverage goals. We had Sean on last week, and he spoke to some of his insights on, the reality of all of that. But what's your perspective?
I think it's interesting. I think I was reading Mike Daniels' coverage of it over at Light Reading, and I thought it was interesting because it sounds like it's a combination of timers in the core, radio software, and other optimizations, and it looks like they've just got a lot of problems they have to solve, almost as if their network wasn't really ready for launch. I think they probably would have been a lot better off if they had waited to launch, but they, were trying to hit a date. So I think that's something to consider, is it's probably not a finished network, and there's going to be a lot of problems probably that they're going to have to work through in the next 6 to 12 months.
Yeah.
There's also, band 70, which should also improve coverage and network performance. So I think this is a very early nascent network that's probably got another year or two of evolving until I think anybody can really make a good assessment of what its actual state is. That's kind of like, if you look at Verizon and AT&T's 5G networks right now, they're incomplete. So I think that when you consider that the big guys are also not really fully built out, and that their 5G networks still have a lot of work to do, it's not really a shock or a surprise that Dish would also have a lot of work to do. I just think those issues that that Dish is having are more experiential.
Yeah.
Um, and I think it's also because they're taking bigger risks and adopting newer technologies in an attempt to try to, catch up with the bigger guys.
Yeah. No, I think your insights are spot on. They are building a greenfield network. They're new at it. And to your point, they're leaning heavily into things like Open RAN and vRAN and cloud native architectures, which the Verizons and AT&Ts and T-Mobiles are leaning into, but to a lesser extent. And so a lot of this hasn't quite coalesced. And with all this disaggregated infrastructure that Dish is deploying, there are integration challenges with that. And we've seen that. You and I have spoken about Rakuten in the past. They've been sort of the poster child for this when they built their LTE network in Japan and deploying as they continue to deploy their 5G network as well. This isn't easy stuff. I mean, it seems agile and it seems, from a CapEx and OpEx perspective, very disruptive, but it's certainly not easy. And certainly building a greenfield network from the ground up, there are additional challenges there. And I totally agree with you. I think it's also, Dish just doesn't have the bench and the experience, although they have hired professionals and leadership from other mobile network operators and infrastructure providers, but there is a learning curve. So it'll be interesting to see how this rolls out. And this sort of plays back into some of the comments that Sean Kinney, who was our guest last week, for the editor-in-chief at RCR Wireless, was speaking to as well. So for our viewers and listeners, if you didn't catch last week's episode, I would highly encourage you to do that. But with that, let's go to your second topic, and you want to talk about SES Launch and C-band.
Yeah, so SES is a satellite communications company, and they launched a satellite called SES-22.
Yeah.
And this satellite was designed to allow the company to clear more C-band spectrum, specifically the higher band spectrum that hadn't yet been cleared. Their deadline to clear that is December of 2023. But they are launching this new satellite. I think they launched it yesterday successfully on SpaceX from Cape Canaveral. And basically this will help them to clear the spectrum and allow Verizon and AT&T and T-Mobile to take advantage of that spectrum.
Yeah.
And they will also get paid by doing this faster. I think Verizon paid them extra money to accelerate their clearing of that spectrum. But even ignoring Verizon, they will be making $4 billion on clearing the spectrum.
Holy moly. That's a lot of clams.
And, they also were on this spectrum for a very long time. So I think between them and Intelsat, there's something like $9 billion to be made on clearing.
Oh, wow.
So, these are the satellite companies that were using the spectrum. And now they're moving to the upper band of C-band. I think they have like 100 megahertz up there. And then there's like a 20 megahertz guard band.
Yeah.
And then there's, the planes above that. So, which we've, extensively covered.
We beat that horse to death.
I know. I'm sure everybody's tired of hearing it, including us. But yes, they're going to actually launch a total of 5 satellites to make the second phase of clearing happen. And this launch carries 1 satellite. While there are 2 more launches later this year that will carry 2 each. And this will give SES enough capacity to support their customers moving forward into the higher frequencies aligned with new satellites. So that's basically it. They're kind of just moving along, quickly to ensure that the spectrum is cleared so that, the 5G operators can use all these large swaths of spectrum that they've paid for.
Yeah, and didn't we talk about SpaceX or Starlink and their contention on the last episode, or one of the last episodes, about?
Yes. So we actually did talk about that. There is an update. I didn't include that as one of my topics, but since you brought it up,
there you go.
They actually sent an email to Starlink customers having them also pester the FCC not to allow 12 gigahertz to be used for 5G.
Oh my gosh, that's
So
crazy.
that's also what's happening this week on the satellite side. But that pretty much wraps my second topic for this week.
Cool. Yeah, and it's SES, not SES Launch. Like I said, I thought SES Launch sounded cooler for their name since they're a
Maybe they
satellite
should
company.
change themselves to that. Yeah.
No kidding. So, well, let's talk about my third and final topic, and I'm going to talk about Verizon. And they recently revealed a 5G connected police cruiser prototype. And I think it's kind of cool because there's sort of a parallel to Blade Runner 2049. I'm a huge Blade Runner fan, love the original. 2049 was pretty good, but I'll get to that point in a minute. So this is actually at what was called the National Sheriff's Association Annual Conference. So Verizon unveiled a modified, I believe it was a Chevy Tahoe, and it's packed with a lot of gear, much more so than typical police cruisers. So it's designed to support 4G LTE, 5G, and 5G connectivity for mission critical push to talk, general mobile radio service, and land mobile radio. And it's got a pretty cool an acronym. So they call the prototype the Mobile Utility Technology Transport, or MUT for short. And it's going to be leveraging millimeter wave and C-band. So obviously, millimeter wave has been the priority from a deployment standpoint for Verizon and its 5G network, and it's lighting up C-band, as we've spoken to on prior podcasts. But what I really think is cool about the prototype is that there's actually a design that would allow a drone to deploy from the cruiser, and that would enable, obviously, first responders on the scene to assist in emergencies. We've seen drone deployment from the likes of Verizon's and AT&T's of the world with respect to tornado and hurricane disaster recovery efforts, fallen buildings, like that unfortunate incident in Florida with that building collapse. But yeah, I mean, it kind of reminds me of the car on Blade Runner 2049, where the drone kind of came out and followed Ryan Gosling's character in different scenes there. But I think it's super cool. I've been critical of Verizon in the past, but one thing that I think they've done a masterful job with is really focused on very specific, discrete 5G use cases. Their currencies that they launched a couple of years ago at a CES show, and they continue to sort of demonstrate that. So I think this is a pretty innovative prototype that would support what they're doing, with millimeter wave, but more importantly with C-band, because that mid-band spectrum is going to provide, that optimal balance of propagation and performance. But would love for you to weigh in on this if you have any, insights or comments.
It does sound a little high tech, but it also sounds a little dystopian.
Yeah.
Especially if we're talking Blade Runner, right?
Right.
I think that there is a place for drones in first responders and helping police and things like that.
Yeah.
But I also think that it's it could potentially create weird scenarios where if your neighbor calls the police and they deploy a vehicle with a drone and you're flying your drone just for any reason,
Right.
you could potentially become a criminal because you're not allowed to fly a drone when there's a drone from first responders in the area. So
Right.
that introduces an entirely other complication to the whole situation around drones and surveillance, and like okay, let's say they have a drone. Are they allowed to fly the drone around your house once they pull up? Because that's them that they're potentially encumbering on your property. So that's like do they need a warrant for that? It introduces so many different potential legal questions that I think it might be a little bit too early for drones being built into squad cars.
Yeah, no, I hear you. And, the privacy concerns around that and, all that sort of thing. But I'm a sci-fi geek. I just thought that was kind of cool. But I think you're absolutely right. So it's super early. It's sort of a tangential note. There's a company, and I believe it's called Axion, if I'm not mistaken. They do a lot of body cam, and they do a lot of technology integration for law enforcement. What's that?
They renamed themselves from being Taser.
Oh, that's right. That's right.
They do
Well, it's
drones, and they also do
yeah. You know, it's
VR
interesting.
training too.
Yeah, what's interesting, I read an article is right after the Uvalde shootings, and their CEO announced a platform that involves drone technology for policing campuses, and it created a lot of controversy, right? And I think it's very similar to sort of your insights and concerns here with this prototype, this proof of concept. Certainly, this could move forward, absent of any sort of drone component. But I think it just demonstrates, the power of 5G. I'll also mention with this MUT platform, the prototype calls for 2 routers versus 1, or what's typically just sort of a MiFi hotspot in a cruiser, and it also includes an onboard server. So there's a lot of computational power to support this prototype. So that also makes me wonder, is it financially going to be feasible as well, right? Because a lot of municipalities have tight budgets, and yeah, this looks like a really cool proof of concept, but the reality is, you're packing all that gear in there, and certainly if you're enabling it to operate on a 5G network, that could be quite expensive. But it's cool, and I kind of geek out on stuff like that, and I continue to look for prototypes like that to talk about on our podcast. But let's move to your third and final topic. And I did catch the story as well on 3 nanometer, but TSMC and Samsung are both talking about it, and you want to provide some insights on what you think it could mean for 5G.
Yeah, so TSMC, I want to say, I think it was last week. They talked about um, their 3 nanometer process. Um, yeah, so it was about a week ago, maybe 2 weeks ago now.
Yeah.
And that was they actually mentioned 4 different process nodes from the 3 nanometer, and they are talking about this thing called nanosheets for 2 nanometer. So the bulk of what they talked about was 3 nanometer, but they also teased nanosheets for 2 nanometer. Um, and that they talk about FinFlex as being this technology that enables them to have different types of 3 nanometer processes for different types of applications.
Mm-hmm.
But both companies are talking about you know like nearly 50% power reductions, and double digit performance, double digit smaller surface area compared to 5 nanometer, which isn't what's a lot of products today. um, and they're talking about all different types of complicated technologies, using gate all around and multi-bridge channel FETs. It's like there's a lot of technical jargon here, but the key is that 3 nanometer is going to bring considerable improvements in power.
Yeah.
It's going to bring considerable improvements in performance, and it's going to help with area, which means that we're going to see more, integrated 5G modems most likely, and we'll probably see a discrete 3 nanometer from Qualcomm in the next year or two, which will eventually become an integrated modem.
Mm-hmm.
And if Apple isn't going to be able to build its own modems quite yet, they're probably going to have to license this from Qualcomm or just buy it from Qualcomm. So Samsung is a smartphone manufacturer. They're also a chip manufacturer, and they're a foundry. So
Yeah.
Samsung's obviously going to give themselves access to the latest and greatest in technology. But what is interesting is both companies announced very similarly around each other about their 3 nanometer process.
Mm-hmm.
And 3 nanometer is kind of going to be the next frontier, before we go down to 2 nanometer or down to angstrom measurements. So it'll be very interesting to see, but generally net positive for everybody. It will probably drive up costs, as it always does, but there are some aerial efficiencies that can be gained to reduce those costs.
Yeah, and so just for our viewers and listeners that are not sort of semiconductor experts like you and our founder Patrick, the benefits, right, are lower power consumption, which means better device battery life, right? What are some of the other advantages?
So thermals will also most likely be lower,
Okay.
generally because when you lower power, you also improve thermals.
Mm-hmm.
And then if you're also able to choose the lower thermal or lower power, you also gain more battery life. So
Yeah.
there's usually a balance. Usually companies will choose to increase power performance a little bit, but lower power considerably, or not lower power at all, just go all full bore on performance. But what's interesting is that Samsung is claiming that they already have their 3 nanometer in production, and that they are ahead of TSMC on that. But the thing is that when it comes to these nanometer measurements, not everybody's nanometers are necessarily measured the same. So you have to take it with a bit of a grain of salt, but I guarantee you there's a lot of comparisons that are going to be made between Samsung 3 nanometer and TSMC, and even whenever Intel gets their Intel as well. So Intel is definitely lagging behind TSMC and Samsung, but Samsung kind of kicked things off today by saying that they've got mass production of their 3 nanometer already in production.
Very cool. Well, hey, it's been another great podcast, my friend. Before we sign off, though, I just want to wish our viewers and listeners a very happy 4th of July. And we may be taking a break next week as I travel over to Paris for the LoRaWAN World Expo. But as soon as I'm back, we'll get another podcast recorded. But Anshel, why don't you take us home?
Absolutely. We hope our viewers and listeners found this week's topics interesting. If anyone out there would like to provide insights on a specific 5G topic for a future podcast, please reach out to us on social media. Will's at Willtown Tech, and I'm at Anshel Sog. We hope you have a great weekend, and please tune in again next week.